Building it brick by brick.
All Americans deserve the right to clean water, and in North Dakota, a brave group of Americans are fighting to protect that right.
We have been attacked by the police and the military for simply saying no, we do not want a pipeline underneath our drinking water source and on our territory.
And the sad part about this whole spectacle is that extremely violent, sophisticated military power is being deployed against a peaceful group on behalf of a law-breaking corporation.
You're supposed to protect and save the people! You're protecting and saving the pipeline!
Pipelines break. They all break eventually.
The history of this company is constant oil spills.
It would poison the people.
It's in the water, and we depend on water for life.
They're just gassing people, macing people. This is not okay. We're here to be peaceful.
One activist was severely injured by a concussion grenade.
Another girl had her eye nearly torn out.
Back to the South Camp!
This is absolutely insane, man. These people are just trying to protect their families, protect their water.
Understand our struggles for the water, for the benefit of everybody.
You're supposed to be protecting the national interest and the state interest. The water is a national interest. The water is a state interest.
I wish they'd open their eyes and have a heart.
Protect the water for the generations that are coming. That should be a priority.
You can't drink oil, and water is life.
We all die without it.
So please, wherever you are, for now and for future generations, stand with the Standing Rock Sioux.
This movement is not founded out of hate.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Lukeman, and this is Brick by Brick. So if you've seen in the video I just shared with you, I know you've been familiar with the incidences and the horrible violence that the peaceful and unarmed Native American and other water protectors were met with in Cannonball, North Dakota, which is what we are familiar with now as Standing Rock. And if you're like most people, you don't know the history of this conflict between the United States government and our Native American brothers and sisters. And I know you've been wondering, how have we gotten to a point in America where law enforcement would respond to peaceful unarmed protesters that way? And all they're doing is protecting their land from corporate encroachment and contamination that's absolutely certain. I know you've been asking yourself, how has the United States government done nothing to intervene on behalf of the Native people in North Dakota? Not only in North Dakota, but in every other area in this country where Native and Indigenous people are protecting their land from this type of shore contamination and violation of treaties. Well, to understand how we got here, we have to know the history of the relationship between the United States government and Native Americans. But to do that, we really have to start in Europe. believe it or not. Because some American history begins long before we even existed as a nation, and it begins in another country entirely. This actually starts with the Crusades. Now, the Crusades, we're not going to go into a big, long, drawn-out explanation of what the Crusades were. Just in brief, the Crusades were military expeditions. They were wars beginning in the late 11th century that were organized by Western European Christians in response to centuries of Muslim expansion. The objectives of the Crusades were to check the spread of Islam, to take control of the Holy Land in the Eastern Mediterranean, to conquer quote-unquote pagan areas, and to recapture formerly Christian territories. Interestingly enough, because of the way society was structured at the time, for people who were not priests or members of any Christian religious order, soldiers in the Crusades saw the Crusades as a means of redemption or a way for them to pay for their sins. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit later why that was, why people believe that. So between 1095, when the first crusade was launched, and 1291, when the Latin Christians finally were expelled from their kingdom in Syria, there were a lot of expeditions in the Holy Land, to Spain and even to the Baltic, and the Crusades actually continued for several centuries after 1291. They continued all the way up until the 16th century. And the 16th century is important because that is when the Protestant Reformation happened and the Protestant faith was formed out of the Catholic Church. I know you're wondering, what does all this have to do with Standing Rock and Native Americans? But stay with me, because this is extremely important to why we're here today. Back then, the Pope wielded enormous power and often directed the actions of actual kings and queens under the authority of the Vatican. So it's important to remember also that during this period in European history, most Europeans couldn't even read. This is where that whole believing that the Crusades were a way to absolve one's sins comes in, because, see, most Europeans hadn't ever read the Bible. And by most, I do mean everyone who wasn't a priest, actually. There was an actual law that was formalized in England in 1172 called the Benefit of Clergy. And it was basically a literacy test. And it was finally employed fully in Europe in 1351. It actually was not abolished until 1706. Why is this important? Because the idea behind it was pretty simple. Only clergymen were literate. The only people who can read in most of Europe were members of the priesthood, either monks or priests or illustrators of the Bible. Most nobility actually couldn't read either. The interesting thing about this benefit of clergy law was that it allowed members of the clergy who were outside of the jurisdiction of royal courts to get away with a lot of crimes that would otherwise have been punishable by death. So for your average lay Catholic, they believe whatever the priests who got their direction from the Pope told them, because most of them had no idea what was actually in the Bible that they believed they lived from. So what does this have to do with the Crusades? Well, consider Pope Nicholas V, who was considered the first Renaissance Pope. He was the Roman Catholic Pope from 1447 to 1445. Why was he considered the first Renaissance Pope? Because he is credited with rebuilding and repairing Rome. He aspired to make it a monument to the power and the prestige of the Catholic Church and the Vatican and popes in particular. So under Pope Nicholas's rule, He reinforced Rome's walls. He paved the streets in Rome. The sewer and water systems were repaired, and the ancient system of Roman aqueducts returned to service. He sponsored the work of scholars and copyists in bringing the works of ancient writers to light after centuries of neglect. Centuries. Nicholas also established the Vatican Library, which at the time was the largest repository of books in Europe. That's all great, wonderful, and fabulous. But here's a part of Nicholas's legacy that is really, really dark. He's noteworthy in regard to native and indigenous history because he issued 2 papal bullas that are credited with giving papal authority to actions by explorers that led to the decimation of native and indigenous people throughout what was then considered the New World. So I know you're asking, what's a papal bulla? Well, a papal bull is a particular type of letter or patent or a charter or an edict, if you will, issued by a pope of the Catholic Church. It's named after the lead seal, the bulla, that's what it was called, that was appended to the end in order to authenticate it. You all have seen the movies, the period pieces, where some nobleman takes a piece of a big stick of wax and he melts it over a candle and he lets the wax drip on the parchment paper, and he takes this stamp and he sticks his stamp in the little piece of wet wax. That's the bulla. And popes would affix their seal to the end of this edict that they would issue, and that's how people knew it was officially from the Pope in Rome. So these bullas that Pope Nicholas is credited with writing actually laid the foundation for the concept of something called the Doctrine of Discovery. And the Doctrine of Discovery is basically the approval from the Vatican or the Pope to have power over non-Christian people for the purposes of either converting them to Christianity or taking their land, possessions, enslaving, or killing them in the process if they didn't convert. Remember, this was during the Crusades, and for Christians, their enemy were Muslims. So really, the first papal bulls were written to be directed at Christian soldiers to carry out against what they believed were Muslim infidels or non-believers. So the first papal bull that was issued by Nicola that is of particular note to native and indigenous history is the Dum Diversas. It was issued in 1452. This papal bull instructed the Portuguese crown to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens. Saracens is a very important word in this edict because it refers to Muslims. Remember, this was during the Crusades. But Nicholas goes further, and he doesn't only direct his edict at Muslims, he also includes pagans and other enemies of Christ. That basically means anybody who isn't a Christian. And he further says in this edict to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ wherever they may be, to put them into perpetual slavery and to take away all their possessions and property. I don't think I can stress enough that when this bulla was written, it was written for the purpose at the time of conquering Muslims, to keep them from spreading Islam past Constantinople, which they ended up doing anyway. So at this time, Christians and Muslims were waging war for centuries, and enslaving and killing each other if each other didn't submit to each other's faith by the sword. But then a second bulla was issued by Pope Nicholas in 1454. It was the Romanus Pontifex. In 1454, Nicholas further stated that the seizure of non-Christian lands and other possessions in Cape Bojador in Africa was allowed for the expansion of the Christian empire. And he restated the legitimacy of enslaving non-Christian people. It's worthy to note that this area was formerly a Muslim area, that the Christians had gone in under the orders of the Pope and taken away from the Muslims. And if people did not convert to Christianity, if they didn't give up their Muslim faith, the Roman Catholic Church allowed for them to be enslaved. Here at this point in the history comes Portugal's King Alfonso and Castilian prince and explorer Henrique, Duke of Viseu, or affectionately known as Henry the Navigator. Now, they were in dispute over who would control the west coast of Africa for the spice trade. The Muslims had been driven out. The Christians under the Roman Pope Nicholas had come in, and the Portuguese and the Castilians were fighting over who would control basically the coast of Morocco. Now, at first, Pope Nick was completely neutral in the dispute until King Alfonso had to help Pope Nicholas V fight the Turks from taking over Constantinople. Now, the Turks eventually won, but Pope Nicholas never forgot that King Alfonso of Portugal was very, very kind to come and help him. And that is why he issued the Romanus Pontifex, in order to give Portugal the divine right to control Africa's western coast over the Castilians. At this point in the history of exploration and the Crusades, these edicts weren't even issued to advance Christianity. They're just favors done. They're just payment for favors done in between a pope and a king. It's just politics, with innocent people caught in the middle. So on we go. What is actually in the Romanus Pontifex that is so frighteningly disgusting? Well, I'm going to read a portion of it to you. It says, since we had formerly, by other letters of ours, granted among other things, free and ample faculty to aforesaid King Alfonso, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, pagans, whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit, by having secured the said faculty, the said King Alfonso, or by his authority, the aforesaid Infante, justly and lawfully has acquired and possessed, and doth possess these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alfonso and his successors, nor without license from King Alfonso and his successors themselves has any other, even of the faithful of Christ, been entitled hitherto. nor is he by any means now entitled lawfully to meddle herewith. What does that mean? All of that flowery language. Well, basically what it means is, because the Catholic Church, the Pope in particular, let me correct that, not necessarily the Catholic Church, because remember, the church is made up of people. And at the time, most of the people who were members of the Catholic Church were illiterate. So they had no idea what was actually in their Bibles. So the people who were making the decisions on behalf of the Catholic faith were literally popes. One person. So there was this idea, this belief that Catholic popes, some Catholic popes, perpetrated, that non-Christians weren't even human. And that in the course of the Crusades, if a Christian warrior encountered a Muslim or a pagan or someone who was of any other belief other than what is subscribed in the Catholic faith, they could be, according to the second papal bull, perpetually enslaved forever. I know that's shocking because most people don't know this history, because who pays attention to world history? As a matter of fact, who teaches world history in high school? But it is very, very important to note that the slavery that is discussed here was not racially based slavery. It was the enslavement of people who were not Christian. And that was everyone who was Muslim, pagan, people who didn't believe in anything. What did this look like? So this papal bull was directed to King Alfonso. And again, it was a thank you from Pope Nicholas V for coming to his aid in trying to fight off the Turks. What did Alfonso get from the Roman Catholic Church? Well, Alfonso basically got all of this territory right here, with the exception of this tiny little spot, which is Tangiers, which belong to England, and I say belong to in quotation marks. But Pope Nicholas V, as a thank you, granted Alfonso, King of Portugal, all of this territory along the coast of Morocco. Politics. So, of course, because the Portuguese and the Castilians were fighting over this territory, the Castilians didn't like that. So there was this battle between these two factions of people. They wanted to control all of this territory, and the history books sanitize this fight between the Portuguese and the Castilians by saying that they wanted to expand Christianity. No, that's not really what they wanted to do. What they really wanted was wealth. What they really wanted, what all rulers who subjugate groups of people in the entire history of humankind, what they all want are power and money. So in comes Christopher Columbus. Now, we all know the story of Christopher Columbus in the little rhyme that we learned in elementary school. We're not even going to go into that because that's not true. who was Christopher Columbus? Well, first of all, he was the son of a wool merchant. Nobody particularly special. He worked on a merchant ship as a teenager. He studied in Lisbon to become a navigator. At some point, he believed that he could find a direct water route from Europe to Asia without sailing along the west coast of Africa, which is what all of the other navigators were doing at the time. That's what all of the other explorers were doing. So he shopped his idea to the Portuguese and the English officials so they could fund his expeditions, because that's the only way he could get money to try out his theory. But nobody believed him, because at the time no one could actually get to Asia from Europe via a direct route. They couldn't do it on land because of all of the hostile territory in between Europe and Asia. So the only thing anyone had figured out how to do up to that point was to sail around the coast of Western Africa. And that's one of the ways that Western Africa became colonized by the Portuguese and the Spanish and fought over by them. But even though the Portuguese and the English wouldn't fund Christopher Columbus's wacky idea to sail directly from Europe to Asia, the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, did. Why? Because they wanted money and power too. So Christopher Columbus is, of course, credited with discovering the Americas. Although, really, he didn't intend to discover the Americas. When he landed on the island of what he called San Salvador, which is really in the Bahamas, he thought he was in Asia. He obviously wasn't. The natives actually called that area Guanahani. Already, he lands his ship there and he takes the name away from the place. So while he is in the area, he explored Guana, which is now Cuba, and Hispaniola, which is now Santo Domingo, or also the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He brought a small amount of gold, some native plants and birds back to the King and Queen of Spain. And he also brought back on that from that first journey the first kidnapped natives from the islands that he explored. Christopher Columbus wrote a letter to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella about what he found. He said, "I discovered many islands inhabited by numerous people. I took possession of all of them for our most fortunate king by making public proclamation, and unfurling his standard, no one making any resistance." Now, in a later episode, we are going to talk about Christopher Columbus's diary entries about what he saw and how he characterized the people that he encountered during this first expedition. But it is very interesting that he says that no one made any resistance. Because you see, the indigenous people weren't hostile. And they didn't believe in possessing land as Europeans did. Possessions or ownership of things was a concept that did not exist in indigenous cultures, because for most indigenous cultures, they belong to the land. They are the caretakers of the land. Europeans didn't see it that way. So King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella wanted to keep Portugal from laying claim to the riches of the lands that Columbus discovered. When he wrote them this letter, they said, there's a lot of great stuff that we can get from this area that they all thought was Asia at the time. And we are in this bidding war, this exploration war with Portugal. And we can't let them get the upper hand. So you know what we should do? We should go to the current Pope and get him to issue a bulla making making it legal for us to claim the lands that Christopher Columbus has discovered. And that is exactly what they did. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella petitioned Pope Alexander at the time to issue a decree to establish Spain's rights to possess the lands that Christopher Columbus found. So who was Pope Alexander VI? Well, he was Spanish born. He was a pope from 1492 to 1503. What was the big deal with him and his role in what we see today with the relationship between the United States government and indigenous people, and not just the United States government, by the way? Well, Pope Alexander VI issued the papal bull Inter Cetera in 1494 when Columbus returned from his first voyage. What was the bull Inter Cetera? What did it say? What did it do? Well, it was issued to settle a dispute between Spain and Portugal that escalated as a result of Christopher Columbus's first voyage, and it was issued at the request of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. The decree Inter Cetera established that Spain could claim any discovered land that was not already held by a Christian noble authority, and could claim land, quote, west from a line drawn 100 leagues toward the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as the Azores and Cape Verde. The Inter Cetera granted Ferdinand and Isabella full and free power, authority, and jurisdiction of every kind over almost all of the Americas, save for a portion of modern-day Brazil and a few island outposts. So with the stroke of a pen, the Pope created an imaginary line dividing the world on a north-south axis in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. All the territory east of the line of demarcation was granted to the Portuguese, and all of the territory to the west was the sole domain of Spain. The Pope did this under no other authority than he believed God gave him the divine right to, because he said so. Portugal and Spain agreed to an amended agreement based on the Inter Cetera because Portugal wasn't happy with the original line of demarcation. They felt like they didn't get enough territory to claim, and they felt like they didn't have enough sea lanes to travel through. They felt like they would always have to be bumping into the Portuguese, and they would always be at war with each other. So the Inter Cetera was amended twice, and it was finally signed in the Spanish town of Tordesillas. This document that was the result of this treaty signing was called the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal. And the Treaty of Tordesillas created this very interesting division of what Portugal could explore and claim and what Spain could explore and claim. I hope you can read that there. It says the line of demarcation between Spanish and Portuguese territory, as first defined by Pope Alexander VI and later revised by the Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain won control of islands discovered west of the line, while Portugal gained rights to new lands to the east here. Now, here is where, my secondary screen has just decided to go to sleep. Here is where all of this comes into play. Because the Treaty of Tordesillas is the foundation for what is known as maritime international law or international maritime law and the international law of nations. The international law of nations basically holds that all Christian nations have a right to unfettered exploration all over the world and to claim land that is not already claimed by another Christian nation. This law of nations has been in effect since the time of this Treaty of Tordesillas. I can't even pronounce the name anymore because I'm so annoyed with this whole thing. The Treaty of Tordesillas. It has been adopted into every European nation's set of laws, constitution, practices, both informal and formal. It has been the basis for European conquest, all under the guise of the so-called Age of Exploration, which spread Christianity throughout the quote-unquote New World. And it was the foundation for the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is honestly nothing more than the first two papal bullas, declaring that Christian nations, sovereign Christian nations, could not declare, sorry, my laptop has finally come back up. Yay! Let me get back in here so I can get my notes back up for you guys. That sovereign Christian nations could not declare ownership of land that another sovereign Christian nation owned, also by right of Doctrine of Discovery. But the Doctrine of Discovery went further to declare that Christian nations had a right to either convert the original inhabitants of the land to Christianity, and if those inhabitants did not convert, then those Christian nations had a divine right to do with those inhabitants what they chose. And that included everything from allowing them to live freely on the land, which rarely anyone ever did, to slavery, to genocide. And it is the Doctrine of Discovery that we find that has been adopted into United States law. This is why all of this previous history that started in Europe, that started with the Crusades, that started with all of these foreign popes, is critically important to what's going on today. Because the Doctrine of Discovery, while it wasn't mentioned by name, was given a legitimate stamp in United States law, federal law, decided by the Supreme Court law. In the Supreme Court ruling Johnson versus McIntosh, Justice John Marshall said in his ruling, on the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire, Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. I feel like I have to stop right there. When people like Steve Bannon and Sean Spicer and this Milo person and these white supremacists make speeches today saying that America is for Europeans, they're only citing established law. This is why knowing history is important, because it is only as effective as the hands who wield it. Justice Marshall goes on to say the potentates of the old world found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity in exchange for unlimited independence. Now, at this point, Justice Marshall, I believe, knows he's lying, because this Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntosh, was a dispute between two white men over land that didn't belong to either one of them. They wanted the court to decide who between them should get land that originally belonged to Native people. Justice John Marshall goes on to say, but as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary, in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law, by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted, should be regulated as between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made, against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. This principle was that discovery gave title to the governments by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made, against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. In other words, if a European government discovered land on which people they considered to be non-Christian, pagan, Saracen, otherwise an enemy of Christ, and if that European Christian government wanted to possess that land, they could do so by right, solely because they were a European Christian nation, and the right was divine according to their interpretation of their so-called faith. That is the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery is what Justice John Marshall based his Supreme Court decision upon, that stripped the rights of ownership from Native American people for their land and gave it, in this case, to one of the two white men who were fighting over it. This one court decision, Johnson v. McIntosh, was the legal basis for the continued disenfranchisement of Native Americans in this country from the time of the from the time of the Johnson v. McIntosh decision to today. Because this ruling maintained that Native Americans referred to in this decision as fierce savages and the conquered. It's in the Supreme Court decision. Native Americans had the right to occupy land, but not full sovereignty to own it. It stipulated that tribes were dependent on the federal government. Johnson v. McIntosh became the cornerstone of U.S. federal Indian law. Subsequent court decisions tried to walk back some of the harsher provisions of Johnson v. McIntosh, but it remains to this day the dominant legal precedent in matters of Native American land rights. Here's the key. This isn't true just in the United States. This is also true in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, where large indigenous populations exist. Why is that true? Because remember the Treaty of Tordesillas. Remember that this area was granted to Spain. So when Christopher Columbus made his next voyages, that is when the age of exploration and the doctrine of discovery and all of the horrible destruction that they wrought really began to take root in what we know as the Americas today. So when we see images of our Native brothers and sisters being brutalized by law enforcement, when we wonder why our government officials are silent on the disrespect of their treaty rights, when we wonder why our government officials are silent on the desecration of their sacred grounds, when we wonder why our government officials are silent on the removal of Native Americans from their land, please remember, a lot of our government officials are lawyers. Not all of them, but most of them are. And Johnson v. McIntosh is a very well-known, very highly regarded, and still referenced Supreme Court decision to this day. In short, our elected officials say and do nothing to defend our Native brothers and sisters because they know that the law has already settled that the land isn't theirs. That's the legacy of the doctrine of discovery. History is only as powerful as the hands who wield it. Now, this is just part one of this discussion, because we really have to examine the march through American history now of how Native Americans were systematically, ethnically cleansed, relegated to horrible living conditions, and repeatedly, systematically stripped of their rights, not just their land, but their rights, and continue to be oppressed and denied due process and equal justice today. So, I'm going to leave you with a video. I wasn't able to upload the link, but I'm going to leave you with a video to watch. I'm going to put the links to my sources on this stream when I'm done, and I want you to read. That's your homework from me this week. Read. Understand what the doctrine of discovery is. Understand what the papal bullas are. Understand that even though they are not based in any law, in any legal precedent, they are still considered to be binding in some way. Also understand that there are several religious denominations, Christian denominations, who have petitioned the Catholic Church through the years to rescind all of those papal bullas. I hope you got some information that has been helpful for you. I hope you learned something you didn't know. And I hope you take this information, and I hope you begin to look at our history a little bit differently. I hope that wall of misinformation is beginning to crumble for you just a little bit, because I intend to do that, and I intend to do it one brick at a time, brick by brick. Join me next Wednesday night at 9 p.m. for part 2 of this discussion. Thanks so much for joining me tonight, everyone. Have a great evening.
Building it brick by brick.